All right. The Lord be with you. Good to see you all this morning. As we continue our series on Christianity, blacks, and higher education, I feel like I need to say last week on Christianity, blacks, and higher education, like I'm a promo for a Netflix series or something like that. But I do feel like, okay, just a couple of quick points about last week for those who maybe weren't here, didn't see it, and also maybe just to remind us. One thing we are thinking about is not only the expanding opportunities in work that blacks have made in higher education, but then also ways that among some people, among some whites, racism gets transformed. And I used the sort of framework of racism as a cultural vice, and how does that turn into a virtue over time is one thing that we're going to be looking at through this process, and how missionaries who, for instance, went to Burma brought with them frameworks of basically racism about Asians, condescending sort of attitudes, and were in many ways transformed. And here's transformed by those views, or by the engagement, really. Their views were transformed by their engagement with the Quran. And so that's going to play into our story. And this week, I want to frame my presentation with two key themes. One of them is connections, in thinking that and looking for ways that God is always at work, often in ways that we can't see while we're in the midst of everything. Oftentimes we have to look back on our own lives, or even in history, to see ways that God is at work. But then also, second, is related to the theme that I talked about last week, that this transformation of a cultural vice of racism into cultural virtue. And here's a point that I want to bring out that is related to last week, but will be a theme this week. And that is that theologians have said that people are often transformed when they see God's goodness in other people. That this, Aquinas would say, this is what glory is. Glory is the goodness of God that is shown or displayed. Any aspect of the goodness of God, God's love, His mercy, His peace, His care, His forgiveness, whatever it might be. And what happens is that God's glory can be seen in other people sometimes, if we are willing and able to look for it. And one thing that happened with missionaries in Burma is they were in a place, and many of them were willing to suddenly see God's goodness in the Quran. If you think of people like Shui Bo and that sacrificial love and that meekness, and Elisha Abbott could suddenly see that, and that goodness rubbed off on him and to others. And suddenly you have missionaries who have a broader sense of the capabilities of people of the Quran, of these Asians who are, quote unquote, uncivilized, that actually evangelism and leadership and higher learning really are things that they are quite capable of. And so therefore they can be ordained, and so naturally then you build the Quran Theological Seminary, and that transformation in those missionaries, and that act of, we need to promote this native ministry, and part of that means we need to educate preachers and teachers. That's what the native ministry meant in the 1850s, is going to be very important. So we're going to come back to the United States now, and we come to the time of the Civil War, and the Civil War is a major transformation point for many, many things in American society, but it's especially transformative for blacks, and that does have an impact on black higher education. So to tell that story, I want to look through the eyes of, or the individual story of a person. And did this turn on? Is this going to work? Yeah, Dan, I don't know if I worked, like a good teacher. I tried this out ahead of time, and it worked earlier this morning. Anyway, Dan's going to run and get some help. There is a man by the name of James Holmes. James Holmes was born in 1826. He was enslaved. His parents were slaves. He was born in a little cabin east of Richmond, Virginia. When he was 8 years old, here we go. When he was 8 years old, there we are. There he is. He was sent by his slave owner to Richmond to work in a tobacco factory. And in the tobacco factory, he earned money, wages, and every bit of it was sent back to his slave owner. I guess there must have been some provision for his food and so forth. It may be that he had never saw his parents again after that. If you think about that kind of life. Somewhere in his youth, he had a conversion experience to Christianity, which I want to point out was actually not typical or was somewhat uncommon. Less than 20% of enslaved blacks were Christians before the Civil War. At the age of 15, he was baptized, and he joined a church in Richmond called the First African Baptist Church, which we'll get to. At age 20, he married, and soon thereafter he had children. He became the father of two children. A few years later, his wife's parents, his father and mother-in-law, escaped from Richmond, made their way to Massachusetts. They wrote a letter back to Holmes and his wife, and it got intercepted by government authorities in Richmond. And they accused Holmes and his wife of helping them escape, which may or may not be true. We don't know. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't, but there are no trials for slaves at that time. James Holmes was then arrested, and with this crime, his owner sold him, or was going to put him up for sale. And so he was taken to, in Richmond, a notorious jail, which was for enslaved people, called Lumpkin's Jail. This is 3 blocks from the state capital of Virginia. Lumpkin was the largest slave trader in the city of Richmond and was known for his cruelty, and this particular jail was a particularly nasty place. People crammed together inside many of the rooms, sometimes without access to bathrooms or outside access. One room had 4 iron rings on the floor, and a person would be taken in, and arms, wrists, and ankles would be bolted on or fastened onto these rings, and they were whipped while they were lying down. And that's what happened to James Holmes in this jail. He spent 12 weeks there, and then he was sold to a man who took him off to New Orleans. He never saw his wife and 2 children again. We're not sure what happened to them. They were most likely they were sold and taken off someplace else also. In New Orleans, he joined a Baptist church there, and he worked a number of years. But then his owner in New Orleans committed suicide. And James Holmes got married again because this is life under slavery. You can be separated. You may just never see your wife again. And so so you get married again. And so Holmes was sold to actually his wife's owner. And then his wife's owner, his business failed. And so he was sold again. And his new owner took him to, of all places, Richmond, Virginia. So now he's back in Richmond, Virginia, and once again, he was sent to a tobacco factory, and once again, his master collected all of his wages, and once again, he joined the First African Baptist Church, which is a very interesting church. I'll get to that in a minute. It's a very large church. It was mostly for blacks, but I want to mention one more thing that happened to Holmes, because it tells you more about life under slavery. After church one Sunday, he and his wife stopped by the home of a couple that they knew had just gotten married, and the couple was hosting a wedding breakfast. The problem is that the town officials of Richmond feared slave conspiracies. Richmond had a population of 28,000, and of that 28,000, 12,000 were enslaved people. And then another 2,000 were free blacks, and so they were always very worried that slaves would rise up and revolt. And so they had passed a law saying it was illegal for more than 5 blacks to meet together without a supervisor. And, the Holmes knew this, but I don't know what happened. They thought, look, it's a wedding, or people, surely this won't be something that will bother the authorities, or maybe, we can do this and we won't be punished. But whatever happened, officials broke into the house during the breakfast, and they arrested everyone, including James Holmes, and he was publicly whipped again. But he continued on in his church, this First African Baptist Church of Richmond, Virginia, which was actually really pretty unusual. Holmes was an enslaved person, but he was elected deacon. Okay, so that tells you something about Holmes, that he had some sort of gifts that a church, is a large church, 2,700 members at that time, had a great deal of respect for him, that they would elect him deacon. And it was also a very unusual church, though, because it was a black church, which was almost unheard of in the South, but they were able to have a black church because the authorities said, okay, as long as you have a white pastor and a white board that kind of oversaw everything. And so, oddly enough, all black Christians in the South were pretty much forced to go to church with white people, right? So we talk about segregation. This was like forced integration. And that was so that black Christians could be kept, and then they could keep an eye on them in various ways. The white pastor of First African Baptist Church was a man by the name of Robert Ryland, a Baptist minister who actually had founded a seminary which is today the University of Richmond, the Richmond Spiders, if you've ever heard of them. But also, a little bit later on, he was given the task of overseeing, or maybe he volunteered for it, I don't know, but he became the white pastor who oversaw First African Baptist Church. He was a bit atypical as a white person. In some ways, he cut against the grain of slavery, and he, in this church, gave blacks a fair amount of responsibility and independence in running the day-to-day operations. That's why Holmes could be elected as a deacon. And the deacons managed a budget of $3,000, which was an incredibly large amount of money at that time, which they would use to help the impoverished members of the church, and sometimes they would use it to actually help to buy freedom for enslaved people. They would actually purchase a slave to set them free. Ryland also encouraged, the blacks were not allowed to preach. That was against the law. But he would encourage blacks to stand up and pray from their seats in the congregation. And in the Baptist and Methodist tradition, there's also a tradition of what's sometimes called exhorting, which is sort of like you get up and tell your testimony and you encourage other people. Well, you can kind of imagine what happened. Some of these prayers got very, very long and sounded an awful lot like sermons. And surely James Holmes he had to have been among those that did that, got up and prayed and exhorted and that sort of thing. The mayor of Richmond did not like this, but Ryland and the First African Baptist Church could get along with it. On the other hand, Ryland himself was a person of the South. He came from a slave-owning family. He owned slaves himself, and he opposed abolition. He argued the Bible sanctioned slavery. He argued that the Bible sanctioned slavery, and so he just thought there were bad slave owners, and that he had seemingly a heart for wanting these blacks to become Christians and so forth. He opposed breaking up families, but he could never get to the point where he saw the system itself as evil. He just thought there's bad slave owners and things would be all right if we were good slave owners. All right, well then the Civil War breaks out. And all sorts of things change. especially in areas where the Union military occupies as the war goes on. But early on in the war, in late 1861, just months after the war had started off, the Union Navy had seized control of lands in South Carolina. So I want to jump to South Carolina and what we call the Sea Islands, the islands off the coast of South Carolina. And what happened here is that the Navy had seized the land, and the white slave owners fled inland with the Union military coming in. The enslaved people, they're not going inland with the white owners. They're staying right there. And so now you suddenly have, early on, what's happening is that the Union Army, well, they didn't intend it, they just wanted the land and strategic things. They're kind of freeing the slaves. So like the Underground Railroad was moving into the South by way of the Union Army, almost by accident. It's like, well, what else are we going to do? So suddenly you have these freed people along the coast of South Carolina. And in the North, you get missionary agencies who say, okay, here's a chance for us to spread the gospel to blacks among the South. And so the Baptists had an agency. They had a foreign mission agency. They had another one called the American Baptist Home Missionary Society. And their thought was, let's send missionaries to the South to evangelize the blacks and these freed people and make them, help bring them to Christ. And so very early on, one of the men who went to South Carolina as a missionary to the blacks was Solomon Peck, which, if you might remember from last week, was the man who was in charge of the Foreign Baptist Missionary Agency, who was receiving the letters from Elisha Abbott and the other missionaries saying, should we ordain Karen or not? And he said, oh, boy, I don't know. And then finally he came aboard and he said, yes, we should ordain them. He's the one then who he is kind of starting out as a new career as a missionary himself. Here he, for decades, had been the head of the Foreign Missionary Agency, and he had stepped down from that. And now here he is in the South as a missionary himself for the first time, or kind of a missionary on the field. And what he realized, and what, by the way, other missionaries realized, not only from the Baptists, but Presbyterians and Methodists and Congregationalists who went, as they got down with the blacks, they realized, wait a minute, blacks don't, before the missionaries even arrived. I mean, as soon as they were freed, just something, freedom, suddenly it's like, the slave owners are gone. Now we are really free to need literacy, schools, and higher education. They don't have the resources for that. They don't have the money. And I mean, these former slaves, with a few free blacks thrown in, don't have any money. They don't have trained teachers, so forth. And Peck catches this, right? He figures out, of course, right off the bat. And it just clicks with him. This is very similar to the situation in Burma. You've got a poor, largely pre-literate people who are embracing Christianity. They're very good at evangelizing. The blacks are very good at evangelizing fellow freed people. They are seen by whites as uncivilized, and blacks were seen as uncivilized and really incapable of, things that whites could do. White missionaries are there. They're vastly outnumbered, but the evangelists want an educational system. And Peck did not miss a beat. He said, this is the native ministry, only it's among blacks in the South. And so he was in the South for a while. In 1864, after he'd been in the South for a couple years, he went back north and he organized the National Theological Institute. And the goal was, this is going to organize schools for blacks in the South and find educators who can educate blacks. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. We're going to jump up and a little bit further to the end of the war. When we get to April of 1865, Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, is Well, in April, it fell to Union troops. The war is almost over. Robert E. Lee has retreated out west, and Grant is busy pursuing him. Meanwhile, back in Richmond, Union troops are marching into town. And some of the earliest regiments to come into town are black regiments. The Union had come around to finally figured out that blacks actually can be good soldiers too. James Holmes almost certainly was among the crowd that is watching the black regiments come in U.S. uniforms. I mean, it must have been incredibly, the stories are that the blacks of Richmond were so overwhelmingly excited and thrilled, not only just to see the Union military come in to Richmond, but to see black officers in uniform on horses. I mean, like in a position of authority, as well as black troops and so forth. And there was a scene in which they were, these regiments had come through, and they were in a section of Richmond, and blacks were gathered around, and a black chaplain in the army stopped and in this neighborhood of blacks to give a speech. And he started to speak and suddenly stopped because off behind him in a little distance, he heard a chant and a song, and it was coming from Lumpkin's jail. And there were still enslaved blacks in the jail, and they were chanting, "Slavery chain done broke at last. Broke at last, broke at last. Slavery chain done broke at last. Gonna praise God till I die." And suddenly the troops are like, "Oh my gosh, a slave jail," because they're still just marching in. Here's a jail. They rushed to the jail. They freed everybody. The chaplain broke down into tears. Must have been an incredibly emotional moment. And it was just one of the scenes that day of blacks hugging and dancing in the streets, and women coming up and kissing the soldiers. The whites of Richmond were more sullen, as you can imagine, and quiet. The next Sunday, First African Baptist Church, which was the Sunday in which Robert E. Lee was going to surrender to Grant out at Appomattox, but this is early in the morning. They don't know that that's going to happen. Robert Ryland gets up to preach a sermon, and in the congregation are black Union soldiers. And Ryland, who had supported the Confederacy very, like a lot of whites, very passionately through the war, we don't know exactly what he did, but he did preach a sermon. During the war, he'd published articles in which he said the Confederate cause is a holy cause. So you know where he stands on this. Now, blacks thought the Civil War, there was a holy cause there, but they defined that differently. So Ryland gets up, he preaches a sermon, and somewhere along the line, he urged the black men in the congregation, stay away from the Union Army. Don't join the Union Army. This did not sit well with the Union soldiers in the congregation. And after the service, they went up and handed Ryland a note that said, "We, as soldiers of the United States, may congratulate you for the eloquent sermon preached by you, but would advise you to preach no more of the same kind." And then in the days after that, some sort of debate broke out among the black leadership of First African Baptist Church. And James Holmes had to be in the middle of it. He's a deacon, he's a leader. And we get conflicted report exactly what the nature of the debate was and how the arguments came down, but a lot of it was what to do with James Ryland. Now it's like, what are we going to do with our white preacher? We don't have to have him anymore. And exactly how to respond. What did happen is that Ryland turned in his resignation. He realized after meeting all of this, he cannot be the pastor of this church anymore. The blacks then selected, there was a white abolitionist who'd come down from Massachusetts who'd been there for a few weeks. He was a Baptist, he was a minister. They selected him as their pastor, and James Holmes is made assistant pastor of First African Baptist Church. 1 year later, the abolitionists resigned and returned to Massachusetts, and Holmes was made head pastor of First African Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia. Okay. Meanwhile, Solomon Peck is back forming the National Theological Institute, and he sends to Richmond a missionary, a white missionary named Nathaniel Culver, with the idea that let's set up a seminary for blacks, just exactly like what we had done in Burma with the Karen Theological Seminary. And so he sends this man, Nathaniel Culver, to Richmond. Culver found a place to stay, and that was in the home of James Holmes and his family. But he had a really difficult time finding a building for the seminary because none of the whites of Richmond, who owned all the property, wanted to sell him a building or rent him a building. And he went around for several days trying to find a building, and he couldn't find one. And he finally found a building that he could rent to educate black preachers and teachers. Lumpkin's jail. Lumpkin had died the year before this. This is one of these weird situations. And he had, years before, married an enslaved woman, a black woman. Actually, she was a mixed race woman. She was his wife. It was a little bit like Jefferson and Sally Hemings. To what extent was it consensual? She didn't have a lot of... somehow they worked out some sort of agreement. We don't know exactly how they worked, but the point is that he had died and she now owns Lumpkin's jail. And so she rented it out to Culver and for 3 years. And one of the first students, James Holmes. Because when he had taken over as pastor of First African Baptist Church, they said this was on the condition that he get an advanced education. And of course, there was no place to do that until the seminary opened up. And actually, Culver got ill and actually had to leave and resign before the first classes even started. And so the seminary, the system is now under the American Baptist Historical Society. Peck had merged the Theological Institute with it. And he's like, we have to find somebody to head the seminary. And so the ABMHS sent Solomon Peck to Richmond to head up this theological seminary. And so James Holmes learned under Solomon Peck, and those first 3 years, they met in Lumpkin's jail, which must have been... if you think of Holmes, this was the place where he had been whipped. This is the place where he had been sold away from his wife and children, his first wife and children, who he'd never see again. And now here he is, and this is a place that's going to be used for the black people, black Christians, to raise up. And years later, he was not the only one. Other pastors had been in very similar situations and had been taken to Lumpkin's jail and probably whipped and so forth. And years later, they actually gave a speech to Baptist officials in the North in which they talked about what it was like to take seminary classes in the very building where they had been enslaved. And we don't have copies of their speeches. I wish we did, to know exactly what they said, except we just have comments about them giving it. It must have been very, very striking and poignant. But I also think a powerful sort of symbol of God's redemptive work. There's something very deeply similar to Jesus on the cross here. You take the worst that human beings can throw at God, and God can redeem that. Anyway, I find it really very, very remarkable. And recently, they've found the site of Lumpkin's jail and done an archaeological dig, and there's work to try to make it now a historical site. They are working on that. Well, they met there for 3 years, and then they found another building, and which became something known as the Richmond Theological Institute. And James Holmes could be seen walking with his books down to the Richmond Theological Seminary to get his education. Now, I'm telling the story about James Holmes and Solomon Peck and Richmond Theological Institute just because I think, when you get the individuals together, it just helps us get in that sense of the kinds of things you were dealing with and going on and so forth. But this is just one story. This is just one strand of a much, much bigger story, because there were black institutions popping up all over the South in the years after the Civil War. And so in these 25 years right after the Civil War, a number of HBCUs were formed in the United States. It was at the same time that there was something about freedom that just led to a boom in revivals and Christianity among the blacks. And blacks are now suddenly flocking into black churches throughout the South in incredibly large numbers. And with that, they're very, very interested in education. They're interested in educating their children. We also have stories of I love the story of a grandfather who came in with his grandson and said, I just want to sit in the back, but I got to learn to read. I got to learn to read the Bible. There's this passion for education among many. And in the midst of this, then, blacks have in terms of resources, both in terms of money and in terms of finding qualified people to teach and lead these sort of things. And so black denominations, the AME denomination, the AME Zion denomination, Black Baptist denominations, they still, people really sacrificed, I think, a lot of money and personal income to try to form these things. Mary McLeod Bethune that Andrea Ramsey talked about, and her incredible determination, to form a school is maybe an example of that. State governments and federal governments formed 3 others. One of them was a group of blacks who, right in the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction, blacks had a little more political power, and they convinced the government of Alabama with their white Republican allies to build a school. A couple others were federal government, Howard University, although there were Christians really driving that one too. But white northern denominations helped build 33. And so there's a story here too. There's all kinds of stories here. There's stories about what blacks are doing to try to build. But then, if we're thinking about our transformation of turning, at least among some people, a cultural vice into a cultural virtue, something is going on here, because how do you get these particular denominations involved in this sort of thing? It makes sense that black denominations would. There's really, quite frankly, not much of an effort by white governments. They're white. This is the time when land-grant universities are starting up, Big Ten schools and so forth. The governments are planning colleges, now state colleges, all during this 25 years, all across the Midwest. Just a paltry amount for blacks. White Southerners certainly weren't going to help. The Virginia Baptist Convention made a statement in 1866 in which they condemned Northern missionary educational work among the freed people, and they really said, we are not going to turn over the keys to any of our black churches to black leadership. Although they, in the long run, didn't have the power really to do that, they can't, unlike before the Civil War, can't stop blacks from just forming their own churches. And that is happening all over the South. But the other thing that's curious is why other groups of white Americans were not forming colleges. Let me give you one example. The most curious group that did not build any HBCUs were liberal Northern reformers. These are like former abolitionists. And what's curious about it is that during the Civil War, they did go south to help the freed people. These are people of goodwill. These are people that disliked slavery. These are people that want to help out blacks. They are humanitarian reformers. A lot of them religiously come from Unitarian or Universalist backgrounds, or free thinker, or maybe Protestants, kind of broad-minded, theologically liberal Protestants. And so they go to the South, and they do establish schools for children. They establish elementary schools. And this was good work, and it's very important. But they didn't establish any colleges or universities, which is curious. And in fact, the other thing is that when they did go south, for most of them, their humanitarian work didn't last very long. They didn't really have staying power. Charitable giving to one of the main ones was an organization called the American Freedmen's Union Commission. It declined rapidly after the war, the giving to it, and most of its teachers returned to the North, and it disbanded in 1869. 4 years after the war was over, it disbanded. They said, well, our work is done. We've set up schools. Now the blacks are teaching themselves. There was another one, the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, lasted a bit longer, until 1874, but it didn't assist blacks in building any HBCUs. Similar to the government agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, like when you went to school, you all heard about the Freedmen's Bureau, did you hear about? Maybe not. Depends on your history teacher. Okay, you didn't. Today, they are learning about the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a government agency set up during the Civil War to help the freed people with legal help and economic things, and they also helped with some schooling. And in all the textbooks you hear about the Freedmen's Bureau, and you don't really hear about the missionary societies, at least not very directly. But the Freedmen's Bureau did help establish Howard University, which is one of the leading black colleges. But it only lasted until 1872. And it died off. So why didn't good-hearted, reformed-minding organizations last or try to build any colleges? And the reason is that their frame of mind was that slavery had so degraded African Americans, and this is part of the stereotypes of the time. They were so degraded that what they really needed first was to learn characteristics like honesty and how to handle their money and how to work hard. And so their main thinking in going south is we want to sort of socialize the freed people into becoming good American citizens. And many of them thought the adults are so degraded by slavery, they're kind of really past helping. We just got to go for the children. If we teach the children good, like Yankee virtues, then they will be good American citizens. And many of them thought it would be a long, long time of development before African Americans really would be fully capable American citizens. Some of them said this is going to be decades. Some of them said it's going to take as long as a century before that development would take place. And so their main goal was, in essence, we got to civilize these blacks who have been degraded by slavery. And so you start with the school. Build elementary schools, which is good. It's great that they were building schools. And by the way, the process of bringing literacy to blacks after the Civil War is another amazing story. The literacy rate among blacks grew tremendously in the decades afterwards, and that's, I think, a great accomplishment. But the effect of this was that it was difficult for these humanitarians, to see how poorly educated, uncivilized former slaves might benefit from higher education in some ways. They were still shaped by that sort of cultural vice of, even though they have good hearts and are doing good things, of, yeah, but these people aren't really capable, are they? But we have these 33 schools founded by white denominations. What's the story here? Okay, it's not even all white denominations in the North. It's 5 white denominations that build these 33 schools. Northern Baptists, who I've talked about, Northern Methodists, Northern Presbyterians, which this church belonged to, Congregationalists. There are four major northern denominations. I feel like I'm on a Monty Python sketch. Four major northern denominations that did this. And they all four of these have one thing in common. They also had a foreign missionary wing where they also had developed something called the native ministry. They also had an experience somewhere, or a number of experiences around the world, just like Northern Baptists in Burma, but they had missionaries in China and India and Hawaii and West Africa and South Africa. And I don't know all those stories, but I don't know if they'd be as dramatic as Shui Bo, who is like, I got to go back and save my village, and I'm going to turn myself in the authorities. But I think several things happened. First of all, the idea of, they all read each other's newspapers. They all read each other's magazines. They were sort of in this cooperative. And so the idea of the native ministry grew, and just by the 1840s and 50s was convincing to a lot of these agencies. In fact, we get it in England. British missionary agencies the same way. They also are saying, yes, we've got to build up a native ministry. So part of it is they're talking among themselves. But I think part of it also is that they are working on the ground with Christians from China and India and Hawaii and West Africa and Africa. And they also are seeing, I'm going to put this in theological terms, God's glory revealed in the goodness of other people. And suddenly there's that, oh, here's this goodness. Here are these gifts that can be found among these people. And so they all have this terminology of the native ministry. And as a result, when you just say, oh, we're doing mission work to the freed people, the native ministry just fits in. So they build colleges also. Fisk University is fairly famous, Presbyterian. The Baptists also build Morehouse and Spelman School, college for women and so forth. So that's really where these 33 denominations come from. Now, to illustrate this one step further, let me tell you the story of this woman, Sarah Chase. Sarah Chase was one of those sort of liberal northern reformers. She came from Massachusetts. She was with a Quaker organization. She was an abolitionist. She had been an abolitionist. And after the war, right towards the end of the war, she comes south. Good heart, we want to help blacks. And she comes to Richmond, Virginia. And she comes with one of those agencies, the Freedmen's Aid Society. And she met James Holmes and says, I want to set up a primary school. And they worked together with the idea of setting up a primary school for black children in his church. And we get these letters from her. And she writes, and I just find them really very interesting. She said, she writes home to supporters, and she says, she went to church on Sunday, to this black church, and she wrote, she was surprised that the sermon lifted me up to heights my spirit seldom reaches. That's James Holmes preaching that sermon, right? And then she met with a committee of black men, which James Holmes is on, from the church, and she was astounded that they were able to get the school up and running in less than 10 days. And get it all organized, right? So the point is her surprise that she's this good-hearted person, but she's coming with these ideas of what black people are like, and then lo and behold, she herself can be moved by a sermon. She's seeing God's glory through James Holmes, and then just in the good Yankee, let's organize things and put them together, and suddenly these black leaders are putting things together in a very effective, efficient way, and she's amazed by that. What's the difference between her and Solomon Peck? Solomon Peck had 2 decades of experience of seeing this very thing happening in Burma, and other missionaries, seeing this, at least reading about it, seeing these things happening in other places themselves, are making these connections between what they do overseas and what they're doing with among the freed people, coming alongside blacks. A missionary in Burma in 1867 was reading about how some white Americans are criticizing missionaries for educating poorly educated African American pastors, like this is just folly and bad and so forth. And he just said, look, he wrote back, every Burman missionary in Burma is giving instruction in theology to native preachers who cannot read and spell correctly. This is what we're doing, and it works. There's something about that engagement. James Holmes graduated from Richmond Institute, became a prominent black pastor, and was actually part of the remarkable growth of black Christianity in the late 19th century. During his first year that he was pastor, he baptized 200 people. Later on, a big revival broke out in 1878, and he baptized 866 in 1 month. How does one do that? That's 29 people a day. I think you'd get tired. But, that's a lot, and 1,100 in one day. And the First African Baptist Church of Richmond grew to more than 4,000 members. As near as we can tell, this is the largest Protestant church in the United States at this time. And he not only got his education at Richmond Institute, then he became a member of the Board of Trustees. And I'm going to talk about this a little more next week, but this is also an important step, right? That you're not only educating them, but that now you're actually giving black ministers, real organizational, administrative authority in institutions like that. And so he helped this institute that ended up educating hundreds of more black preachers and teachers and other graduates. It became known as the Richmond Theological Seminary for quite some time. It was under that name, and you can see they got funds. By the way, this next week, but more than just ministers, but teachers and other sort of professionals. And eventually, Richmond Theological Seminary becomes Virginia Union University, which is still around today, and that's what it's known as. 17 years after James Holmes died in 1900, another man came as a student to Virginia Union University. Didn't stay too long, but he came. It was Benjamin Mays. If you're founded by the Baptist Home Missionary Society, and as a professor at Morehouse, became a very, very important teacher to Martin Luther King Jr., among all kinds of other people, but most famously Martin Luther King Jr. So here's the connection part of this. If we think of black higher education as this large tapestry of all these threads coming together to weave into this tapestry that's going to form some sort of picture, what we have here this morning is one thread among many that is weaving through here. And I think we can say, okay, this thread begins in Burma with Karen, who display, even as they're learning to lead, these amazing qualities of meekness and sacrificial love and so forth, which has an influence on Elisha Abbott, who says we ought to ordain these people, which has an influence on Solomon Peck to help send missionaries over to form the Karen Theological Seminary, which then transforms Solomon Peck's understanding of race, which leads him in the Civil War to become a missionary and then to form a college to educate people like James Holmes, who goes to college himself at Lumpkin's jail, but then later becomes a member of the Board of Trustees, among other things, as a black leader in Richmond, that produces more graduates who produced more people at Virginia University, who produced Benjamin Mays, who produced Martin Luther King. Maybe it's too strong to say produced, but had an influence on, right? This is one thread among many. There's so many other threads here. And I don't know the story of them all. And I don't know if the story will ever be able to be told completely, because I don't know if we'll be able to get all the sources to know exactly how it all fits together. But to me, it's a little picture of the kingdom of God, right? It's just one little piece that forms this black higher education, which is going to be a part. And of course, black higher education is one other piece of this much, much bigger tapestry that God is continually at work. And there are these connections that we oftentimes don't see in the lot, that we will never see, but it's there. And it is at work, and we should take comfort in that, number one. Number, say, okay, where am I in this tapestry? What sort of threads am I connected to with that? And I think also the importance of really working face to face with other people, and that importance of it, how you can, see, the goodness of other people. All goodness is a gift to us from God. The talents we have, the experiences that we have, and we, like the parable of the talents, we get the talent and we have to put it to work. But then we put it to work and God gives us more talents if we're faithful. And that happens in other people. And we see the goodness of others, and it makes us good, right? Better. When we encounter people who are, where we see when we see God's glory in them. I mean, all I have to do is watch a movie of Fred Rogers, and I feel like I'm a better person. Right? If you know anything about, Ben George will talk about that. You know anything about Fred Rogers, just and it rubs off on us. And so somehow that is in the process of building up cultural virtues, if you will. So that's my story for today. We got more of the story next week, but you have to come back next week on Blacks in Higher Education, the Westminster class. And you'll see that. So, questions, comments? Yeah.
I noticed this is almost all man-dominated. Is women involved at all?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Why didn't I do more with women? Yes, but it is first of all, it is a male-dominated era, because it's before the 20th century. There is that. But yes, so let me go back and say that there's a whole other story about women and women missionaries, for instance, if we go back that far, having opportunities. But that led to, in the Canton Theological Seminary, 1/3 of all the positions of students were for women. And so there was educating of female Canton also. And among black, at this time, almost all colleges were either male or female. They were segregated by gender. And we do have female black HBCUs. Among those 33 that I showed you, like one of them is Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. And so Morehouse was the college for black males, and Spelman was the college for black females. Just like at the time, Harvard was only for males, but there was Vassar, right? Or Radcliffe, right? Vassar is Yale, or Vassar's a female college that's connected to one of those Ivies. So that is another very important story of females in all of this. But it is a male-dominated era.
That was kind of that era, because the whole Civil War was male.
Yeah. Yeah, and female, there's a whole other story about women, not just black, but white, and how all of that goes. And Andrew Ramsey did such a great job of bringing out black women in the whole process. But, I should point out that Ida Wells went to some of these Christian HBCUs. She spent some time at Fisk. So Mary McLeod Bethune, ended up kind of forming an HBCU. She went to a Christian institution, Moody, so forth. And there are still conflicts and problems with race, which we'll talk about next week also, within these denominations too. other comments or questions? Edith?
My understanding is that there was also discussion within the Black community about how trade education versus
Oh, yeah.
college education.
Yes, yes,
And to some extent that seems to continue on.
yes. That will be part of next week's story. Yes, that's right, that's right. There, at this time, vocational education is sometimes is talked about versus what we might call a liberal arts education. And that all, there, within the Black community, but also within the white community, the questions of how to, what kind of institutions to do with that. We'll talk about that. So, Edith had asked my wife last week if we can talk about this as the zeitgeist, or race as part of the zeitgeist at the time, and which is a great question. And I haven't read a lot about zeitgeist, but I do know it's a German word that's hard to translate, and it means a number of different things. But at least part of my understanding is it's what we sometimes say is what's in the air, which gets what's in the air culturally is what's reinforced by media, but also structures and behaviors and attitudes, and there is this sort of underlying part of culture that's really very, very powerful for good and for bad. And racism has certainly been in the zeitgeist for a long time, but there are these transformations, and I'm curious about the transformations and how they take place. And obviously Martin Luther King Jr. is in the zeitgeist in this for our later 20th and 21st century, and that's part of the story as well as a lot of others. Anyway, all right, well, thank you very much. Let's close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we pray that we might be able to see your glory, the goodness that you give and develop in other people. May we see that, and then also recognize the gifts you have given to us, that we might put them forward to also reveal your glory as well. In your name we pray. Amen.